of all, thank you all for having me speak today. And I first want to call out my co-authors on this work, Ryan Kovac, Adam Sepulveda, Robert L. Chilcacci, Joe Giersch, and Clint Muhlfeld. This was very much a team effort, even though I'm the one presenting today. All right, here we go. So let's get myself on. We've long known of the enormous impacts of invasive species, and we're beginning to understand the implications of climate change on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This work was undertaken to determine what we know overall about how these two enormous drivers of change are likely to intersect. And can we predict when the intersection of these two forces will lead to synergistic effects, additive effects, or possibly even a reduction of invasive species threats as the climate changes? So our goal was to examine this question from a management perspective. Specifically, we were looking to understand what broad-scale patterns have been documented in the literature with this question. Okay, here we go. Okay, there we go. What range shifts have been documented under the scope of climate change, and what are the projected patterns of range shifts under climate change? And are there patterns that could either guide management actions or identify further research needs that can inform management policy? This was very much what we were trying to address with this project. So our region of interest was the Pacific Northwest, which is basically an administrative boundary, but Oregon, Washington, Idaho. We included Western Montana in this, and also British Columbia. This is a region with a wide range of ecosystems, obviously, but it's also one of rapid human population growth and economic activity. And it's increasingly rapid changes in climate and disturbance regime, and certainly drought and fire are two of those. So the first step, what are we asking? We're looking for geographic patterns over mechanisms. And I'm spending some time on the methods here because they're going to be pretty critical to understanding our results, I think. We excluded mesocosm studies or other manipulated experiments. And we did not address ecosystem vulnerability to invasion or what characteristics identify a potentially successful invader. Those are areas of active research and enormous literatures unto themselves, and that was beyond the scope of what we could do. We also limited ourselves to natural systems. In other words, we did not examine the literature for highly managed ecosystems such as agriculture, even though there may be relevant information there. The second step was determining what species we were going to look at. And we made these decisions at the beginning in an attempt to create some sideboards for how much searching we were going to do and to keep the project manageable. We stuck with terrestrial and freshwater species only. We decided to exclude disease organisms, microorganisms, parasites, and their vectors. We also excluded game species and any other species that was managed for any other purpose or value. And our reason for doing this is that the ranges of these species obviously will reflect not just changes in climate, but also management. And so we didn't want to have that confounding factor in the patterns that we saw. We also excluded native species whose ranges have expanded without direct human health. So for example, the barred owl was out, the big bad boy of the Pacific Northwest owl world. But it also means we excluded the literature on native bark beetle species that are actually rapidly expanding their ranges. And there may be information there that would be very relevant to understanding what kinds of triggers and mechanisms we should be studying. We also limit it to species that are either established within the Pacific Northwest or considered a critical invasion threat under current climate conditions. Okay, so who's on our list? This was an interesting problem because we found that there are no universal lists of non-native species. For the aquatic species, there is something called the USGS Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. This is where we identified the species we were going to use in our research or our literature review, but there's no corresponding terrestrial species list. We relied on state noxious weed lists, state wildlife agency websites, seeing if we could get a feel for what states were concerned about what vertebrate, terrestrial and aquatic vertebrates that might be a problem, and any list I could find for insects. And this was really surprising to us. And I'll just point out, if we don't even know what's out there, it's going to be very difficult to stay abreast of what changes and challenges those invasive species might represent. We did go and use the Western Governors list for 50 worst invasives and the world's 100 worst invasives list. And again, we limited the species off of these lists to ones that are either present in the Pacific Northwest or under, whose would be potentially possible invaders under the current climate conditions. So here's a little bit of a rundown of the taxa that we looked at. You'll notice that ray-finned fishes, plants, and insects dominate the list, but we were able to find, we also identified a number of crustaceans, mollusks, a couple of invertebrates in the terrestrial and in the aquatic realm, and a handful of birds, reptiles, and amphibians and mammals. The total was 2 kingdoms, 11 classes, 398 species. 27 were collected from the 100 worst invasives list and 48 from the Western Governors Association list. I'm happy to say that things don't look very good, but we are still not under dire threat from the coqui frog, at least not yet. So our methods with this were, we used Web of Science. And what we did was we searched from November 2017 to March 2018. So this is already 3 years old. And that's worth noting too, because there already have been massive changes in the tools available for particularly prospective mapping of species ranges. We all used the same search term. We looked at the Latin name or common name and climate change and distribution or abundance or spread or impact. And again, I'm really stressing that because our methods really, the results definitely depend on how we searched. There are a number of species that have been known under more than one common name. And in the case of plants, especially significant taxonomic revisions, such that sometimes they're not even in the same genus. And so when that occurred, we searched under all of the common and scientific names that the plant had ever been known in the literature by to make sure we didn't miss anything. We retained studies with climate change or synonymous terms in the title, abstract, or keywords. So global change, global warming, climate change, climate warming, any of those types of terms would pull that paper into the realm that we looked at more closely. And I'll note, just as a side, it's fascinating because those terms change through time. And that in itself would be a really interesting mini study, maybe for an undergraduate student project. And then we extracted information from method and results. Specifically, for each study, we recorded the primary drivers of the invasive dynamics as the researchers reported them. Excuse me. They included precipitation, temperature, stream flow, air temperature, snowpack, things like that the study included. We recorded the range dynamics, demographic changes in survival, fecundity, or abundance, or impact that was noted in the paper with respect to the drivers that had been identified. We recorded whether it was a documented or a predicted climate impact, whether or not the study had occurred within the native range, and whether or not the study had occurred within the Pacific Northwest. And our goal was to perform a meta-analysis of the results of all of these studies examining different taxa across both terrestrial and freshwater and aquatic environments. However, we quickly discovered that there were some pretty serious issues with the literature as data. And the first was that the methodology and output, whether it was a qualitative or quantitative study, for example, varied tremendously. There was very little that could be directly compared. Most of the papers were projections of climate models and habitat suitability models, but the climate projections that were used or the habitat suitability models that were used varied tremendously and really made direct comparison very difficult. And many of the papers also were extrapolating from large-scale climate projections. And even a few years ago, those maps were at much coarser scale than they exist today. So we limited ourselves to qualitative comparisons. That became clear fairly quickly that we would need to do that. Well, our results were surprisingly that there are very few studies documenting actual changes in distributed abundance, spread, or impact of non-native invasive species anywhere, let alone in the Pacific Northwest. We found only 10 studies for 157 aquatic invasive species that we searched. Of these 10, only 3 actually addressed changes within the Pacific Northwest. 5 studies for 241 terrestrial invasive species. Of these 5, only 2 addressed changes within the Pacific Northwest. And so this was really a shock to us. I've forgotten how many thousands of papers that we examined, but it was a lot. Very few studies, again, documented this. The Western Governors List, as I mentioned, we included 48 of those species in our review, but only 4 of them have any information on them as we searched for it. And for the 100 worst invasives list, we included 27, and 5 had been studied. And so it's really amazing because these species, of course, are on these lists because they are considered to be at very high, high impact species to economics or societal concerns. But despite that, there's not much understood about how their ranges might change in the future with climate change. So some of the results here. For the terrestrial, we found 2 studies looking at the ranges of feral pigs and gypsy moths, and 3 beyond the Pacific Northwest for terrestrial studies, including gypsy moths, potato tuber moths, which are primarily an agricultural pest, and house sparrows. For the aquatic studies, there were 3 within the Pacific Northwest, and all 3 of these dealt with the hybridization between West Slope cutthroat trout and invasive rainbow trout. And I'll note that Clint Muehlfeld's lab was involved with all of these. And then beyond that, there were 7 studies, and they looked at a number of different species, 1 plant, zebra mussels, so 1 invertebrate, and then a number of fish species. So pretty limited considering the number of species that we actually looked for in the literature. So what have we documented and what do we know? For the aquatic world, we know that climate change has mediated invasive species expansions, even with the very limited data that we do have, and that appeared to be correlated with increasing air temperatures and decreased precipitation. For the terrestrial side of things, climate change appeared to both facilitate and limit range expansion by non-native invasive species. So it was a little bit more variable in the patterns we found with a very small number of studies that we looked at. The prospective studies were a little bit more, there were more of those out there in the literature. We've found a total of 93 papers that examined this for the species that we looked at, and there were 117 species-specific predictions, of which 43 were aquatic and 74 terrestrial. 30 of these studies overlap with the Pacific Northwest, but only 6 of them actually were limited within the Pacific Northwest, and those 6 studies addressed 11 species. There were no studies on 8 of the 27 non-native invasive species in the 100 worst list, or for 27 of the 48 species in the Western Governors List. So again, what was striking is how much work has not been done on these species that have been identified as potentially very problematic. The general methodology that all of these studies used, though, was to use climate projection models, ecological niche models of some sort, some type of climate suitability model in order to project future ranges under different climate scenarios. So we had better representation of taxa in this group of studies. There were 43 predictions for aquatic species, 26 fell within the Pacific Northwest. And you can see here that there's fish, crustaceans were actually fairly well represented, but then a smattering, 4 for mollusks, 9 for plants, 1 mammal, 1 reptile, and 1 amphibian. So the taxonomic shift was still toward fish with a little bit of everything else. The predictions ranged, but one thing that was also noteworthy is how few of the species had been the subject of more than 1 study. Only 2 of them were rainbow trout and Asian clam for within the Pacific Northwest. And overall, the projections were all over the map. Both mollusks, all 5 plants, and the mammal were projected to increase. And that was the nutria, if you're curious. And the 4 species of fish was pretty mixed response. And so there weren't any strong patterns overall here. For the terrestrial, again, we had 74 predictions for 47 terrestrial species, so a little bit more replication. And it was split about evenly between plants and insects with very little work done on the mammals. There were only 2 mammal species. For the terrestrial non-native invasive species in the Pacific Northwest, there were 15 predictions of increase and 26 projections that overlapped. But it was a mixed bag. For plants, 7 species were going to expand ranges according to these studies, 3 were static or even declining. For insects, similarly, 6 expansion, 4 static or declining. Mammals, both of them, all 2, the feral pig and the feral cat, were projected to increase, although again, the methodology was really variable and it made comparisons a little challenging. So overall, what I want to leave you with is that there's been very little research overall looking at how climate change might be facilitating or inhibiting invasive species spreads. Few species have been the subject of even one study. Fewer still have been examined in more than one, making comparisons or generalizations absolutely impossible at this time. Prospective studies probably should be used as a basis for further inquiry rather than management actions, although as the grain improves in those studies, they'll become better and better at helping us identify what possible mechanisms might be. But the important take-home thing is that climate change is likely to facilitate the expansion of many invasive species, but not always. And it may actually limit the expansions in some cases. And this is going to be extremely important for management to understand, because the worst thing we could do right now is invest a lot of money and time trying to limit the range of something that isn't going to go anywhere anyway. And local conditions, another thing that did come out in some of the work that I didn't have a chance to highlight here, is that local conditions are still likely to affect establishment and persistence, which has been true of invasive species pretty much all along. So for next steps, we really could use a comprehensive database of non-native and native invasive species. There's nowhere you can go now to find out whether or not something is in your neighborhood that's coming to you, if you will. And it's very hard to understand what might be happening if we don't even know who's involved. More fine-grained projections, as I said, are likely to greatly improve the relevance for making predictions and identifying possible mechanisms, and that'll be an important thing going forward. And then eventually we'll be looping back with the work done on mechanisms at smaller scales, that information that I talked about earlier, looking at mechanisms, mesocosm studies, field experiments, and theoretical work trying to understand what characteristics are related with successful invaders. So with that whirlwind overview of this massive review project, I'll take any questions.